So the talk, community-supported publishing. So when Areas started, there was a sense that the left, the sort of cultural and political left in the city of Chicago was particularly fragmented. So in this totally unscientific chart, I outlined some of the different areas, some of the different fragments and tendencies that things were occurring in at that moment in early 2005. So the city of Chicago, kind of unique as far as a major city in the U.S., in that it has had the same mayor for 21 years. So the city is the home to the largest futures trading and commodity market, financial market in the world. It is also the third largest, after Hong Kong and Singapore, intermodal port, which is how different modes of shipping and transit intersect. And then in terms of a legacy that the work that I'm involved in draws from, it's also home to the Haymarket Riot in the late 1800s, which is largely generally considered to be the sort of birth of May Day, the workers' holiday, May 1st, the site of the '68 Democratic National Convention, which both brought a lot of, is a reference point for sort of protest culture, but also brought us Nixon. The way that this project started was I got a grant, and so because of some of the relationships I had from these past projects I'd been involved with, I formed an advisory group of people working in art and activist organizations and initiatives across the city. And the advisory group, the very first conversation that led to figuring out what this publication was going to become, basically insisted on a few tenets that we would try and achieve or work around with this publication. One of them was that it would be locally focused, that it would try and attempt to have multiple literacy levels in the same, integrate multiple literacy levels into the same conversation and literally the same newspaper, meaning that we just didn't want to necessarily assume anything about the kind of audience that we were going to get, because we were actually trying to produce an audience through the work that we were doing. And so it was going to be a new audience. And that it was going to be, a fairly important thing was that it was going to be focused on practices, on stuff that people were doing in Chicago. And so in that sense, that would affect how we would relate to sort of more theoretical content as well, because it was actually about sort of ideas through the lens of things that people were doing, so that people were actually testing out their ideas and not necessarily just a theoretical one. A few important things about this publication to get off my chest that might help you understand it. So it comes out twice a year. There's 5,000 of them printed. And there are 25 to 50 contributors per issue. So that's, I mean, it's like over 400 people or so at this point that have contributed to the publication. And so then I'm going to do a case study so you understand like some of the kinds of stuff that might have happened in the course of producing a publication. So the issue number 8, Everybody's Got Money Issues, was unusual for a few reasons. But for this one, a number of people had overlapping interests, like they would propose an idea for the publication, and it really was basically the same idea as what somebody else who they did not know previously proposed, maybe in a different form or maybe in a similar form. And so in that one, we really started to actually just pair people. So two people basically said that two people who did not know each other said that they wanted to map what they called they didn't both use this language, but that they wanted to map the solidarity economy of Chicago. And which meant slightly different things to both of them, but they sort of were suggesting the same thing. And so basically we got one of the illustrators that we had worked with really consistently to basically kind of mediate both of their ideas about what that meant and produce this flow chart. So this was two people who did not previously know each other, but basically had a sort of simultaneous invention of a concept. that they wanted to pursue in this publication, and then the illustrator kind of mediate for them ways to present that information. So basically, you can look at this later, but what they ended up coming up with was that this, in its entirety, is sort of represents the solidarity economy of Chicago, but that in this kind of, I don't exactly know the orientation, but in this side represents, no, it's the top and the bottom. So the bottom is kind of free in capitalism, things that are free within the dominant economic system, and that these tend towards to be free from capitalism, is the argument. This is not my argument, this is their argument. So that this would start to give you a sense of how to talk about things that were similar but not. Another great dialogue from the 4th issue of Area was called Art on the Outside, which was basically the issue is the first time that we had a guest editor, and it was a guy named Ryan Holland, who is really like a professional in the field of kind of community justice and alternatives to incarceration, and he did a really great job editing a publication that was kind of a survey of like all of the people doing work around prisons in Chicago, but what it sort of didn't include initially was a conversation with all the artists who were doing work either with prisoners or people who were developing conceptual work that was about prison. And so this was a conversation between 4 artists that do that kind of basically argued for the fact that, like, if you are making work, like artwork that is about a certain kind of politics, that like it doesn't necessarily, that it actually could benefit from being in conversation with people who are doing political work, as opposed to making work about a certain theme, like making work about prison, but always just having your artwork contextualized within art history instead of the history of prison activism. So this was kind of a thing that we were experimenting with, and that was a successful example of it. Just a few things about the organizational structure that might be kind of interesting or useful. So this little graphic represents 2005. And then this is basically where it got this last year in the spring of 2010. So I said I was going to leave about a year ago this fall, and we did some really interesting things where we basically, I said, hey, I need to do some other things with my life. Should we end this project? If we are, we should maybe do it in a really interesting way and not do it in a really like sad way where it dies slowly and it's depressing and not a good example. And then people were like, no, let's not end it. So I was like, okay, then let's go through a very intentional process about transitioning the leadership of this organization and figuring out what's going to be the best in the long run. It's unusual as a publication in many regards, but one of the things that I think like we really have tried to do, and I think the area will keep doing this now that I'm not involved too, is that it sort of had maintain the function that a publication would conventionally have of like documenting stuff, but that the thing that we tried to marry that with, that documentary role, was networking through that process, so that like the process of making a documentary about ourselves and the social movements that we're a part of in our city actually also built and strengthened relationships in that process, and so that was, I think that's kind of unusual, and I think that was also the whole reason to do it in the first place. So, so that's my conclusion. Thanks for experimenting with this.